So the next speaker will be Tony Graham, and he will tell you something about the differences between CSS and formatting objects.
Pass me your water.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Okay. So, am I on? Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Jurka. So, comparison between XSL-FO and CSS. This this talk and paper is reduced from a book that Antenna House has produced, which is XSL-FO CSS comparison. The book itself is currently around 150 pages, so I could read maybe 10 pages a minute and you'd understand it all, but I just cut it down to a minimal amount. So I'm going to talk firstly about XSL-FO and CSS and the parts of the comparison, and then in the second half of the talk I'll talk about how I've produced the book. The pages are practically identical for the version that's produced using CSS and the version that's produced with XSL-FO. It's done as an exercise to show that you have comparable results with both of those. So why did we do this? Firstly, it's response to user requests. Some of our users asked, like, what's the difference? Which one should we use? Because AH formatter supports both. So the comparison document, which sort of started out as a list and then turned into a table, you'll find that the table in the paper, and then is now turned into this 150-page document. The comparison is useful if you're starting out and you want to explore whether XSL-FO or CSS is useful to you. You can look at the large table of differences and then drill down into the different chapters for specific differences. It could be useful if you're familiar with one, if you know XSL-FO and you want to transition to CSS or using CSS and you wonder why people still use XSL-FO or vice versa. Or if you're like me and you work with both, but sometimes there's differences that might trick you, like the inheritance of the stuff you put in the headers and footers is the property inheritance will be different from XSL-FO to CSS. So it's good to have a reminder of that. So in comparing XSL-FO and CSS, I'm going to look at the history of how we got to where we are and informal discussion of the viewpoints of people who use the different technologies, and then a very small amount of the feature comparison. So if we go back to 1996, DISL, an ISO standard, which is part of the HTML standards, I already opened the door to talking about HTML, so I don't feel ashamed, came out. It's the formatting part of HTML. At the same time, CSS1 became a W3C recommendation. CSS1 was built on previous technologies, and it's credited as co-invented by Hakon William Lee and Bert Boss. The goals, as stated for CSS1, include CSS supports stream-based or incremental formatting where possible, and offers both readers and authors control over style. So I don't have a column for XML, but XML became a recommendation in 1998. The XML, as it was conceived, was meant to have three parts: XML, a style language, and a linking language, and XSL became, or the XML style, or whatever it was, became XSL, Extensible Style Sheet Language, which initially contained a transformation part plus a formatting part, because this or before it had also contained transformation plus formatting, though in practice we mostly used the formatting part, and even the formatting engine that we all used developed a transformation part that worked like it was formatting. Along the way, XSLT was seen to be broadly useful, and it became its own family of standards. And what you find in the XSL recommendation is a short chapter that says go and look at XSLT for the transformation part, which conceptually, to the XSL recommendation, is still part of XSL. Along the same timeline, CSS2 became a recommendation in 1998. So we have two things developing, not really in parallel, as in almost in antagonism, but there's a tag finding from the W3C Technical Architecture Group which said that consistency of properties is part of the fundamental architecture of the web. So you'll find that CSS and XSL-FO, for the properties that were defined when they were both still being worked on, if you have the same concept, you use the same property name and the same property values for them. So a border is a border whether it's in CSS or in XSL-FO. XSL 1.1 became a recommendation in 2006. After that, there was a workshop in Heidelberg which was attached to a W3C print symposium sort of thing. At that workshop, people talked about what we want in the next version of XSL-FO, and Tanner House proposed that there be more cooperation between CSS and XSL-FO, but that was sort of voted down by the participants at the workshop. XSL-FO continued with a sort of reduced working group and eventually petered out before producing an XSL 2.0. CSS was modularized so that people could work at different parts at different speeds rather than having to get everything cooked all at once to make a single recommendation. And in recent years, CSS has produced what they call snapshots, which describes the current state of the different modules, the ones that are stable, the ones that are still experimental. The CSS Page Media part of this, as we've heard yesterday from Andreas, is sort of found and it doesn't get much attention, doesn't get much love. And in fact, some of the properties for Page Media which were defined in working drafts, I don't know, 5, 10 years ago, have since been dropped from more recent working drafts as not applicable. It's hard to go back and find out what the properties were at different points in time. So I've used the properties implemented by AH Formatter as a bit of a proxy. If you look, this purplish bar is the properties it implements that are both defined in XSL-FO, for XSL-FO and CSS2. And these ones are the CSS3 properties that are equivalent to properties that are already defined in XSL-FO. In contrast, the properties that are applicable just to CSS for Page Media, as far as implemented by AH formatter are much smaller than the common properties. So this is an informal summary of how a person using one technology might think about the other technology. It's informal, no scientific research behind it whatsoever. So a gripe for a CSS person might be that you need to transform your markup, which of course most CSS users would think has to be HTML, into something else before you can use it. Well, that's very true, but as we saw yesterday, you quite often need to transform your source into something else before you can print it with CSS, because you need to generate or update the table of contents, you need to generate the index. For CSS, you need to generate content in the flow that will be taken out as a running element to be used in the headers and footers. So somewhere along the way there has to be a transformation. You'd hope, I would hope there's a transformation to improve the appearance and the information content of your formatted printed document. The use of separate attributes for XSL-FO is verbose when you have properties and the properties can cascade, etc. But if you come from XSLT, then being able to work with attributes and generate individual attributes is just like natural. You could use JavaScript instead of XSLT to do the transformation part if you do the transformation. Well, that's very true, but I haven't seen a standard JavaScript architecture for doing transformation the way that we just naturally use XSLT to turn markup into markup, in this case into XSL-FO markup, if you're using XSL-FO. So the FOs are like elements with a fixed display property. This display property in CSS says this element should be formatted like this. It's sometimes used to make lists look like tables in an HTML page, but if you have the transformation before formatting, then the decisions about how this element should end up are done in the transformation. You don't need to change it on the fly when you're formatting. XSL-FO can't be used for web and print. That is for the most part true, although Ken Holman demonstrated or talked about something yesterday where he generates EPUB from his XSL-FO, although that is not widely used.
There's a complaint from people watching this live.
I'm not surprised. Okay. I shall talk louder. Is that better? So CSS is easier to use than XSL-FO. In a sense, yes. In a sense, no. I mean, the structure of CSS as a selector, a body with properties, which is property name and then a definition, is conceptually simple, but there's an exploding amount of CSS properties, many of which have their own micro syntax. The charter for the CSS working group from 2004 described CSS as a large and complex language. They've been adding properties since then, but their more recent charters just say that it's a large language. Somehow they've mastered the complexity without reducing anything. And there are more CSS users than XSL-FO users, which is very true, but of those, there's a small core that at this point understand CSS for page media. We, of course, would like for there to be more people using CSS for page media. Sort of informal view from an XSL-FO about CSS is that CSS just decorates the tree, which is very true, but it's part of the initial goals for being streamable and just working with the document. CSS selectors won't look down or forward. We heard this yesterday in a question from someone at one of the Page Media meetings yesterday. Again, this is part of the design goals of CSS and the design goals of the browsers to do things quickly. There was many years ago there was resistance when Yerka tried to get CSS selectors to even look into the attributes, and part of the rationale for why they accepted his proposal for possibly a short time is that it would help get rid of XPath if they could select on attributes. Because CSS only operates on elements. Again, from the discussion about Yerka's proposal for attributes, it's clear that people who think in terms of CSS think only in terms of elements. But if you're using XSLT, then you quite possibly match on the text content of an element, or you quite possibly match on the text content by looking up a key from somewhere else or some other document to work out what to do. The feature comparison document has these chapters in it. I'm really not going to go through them all right now in my remaining 11 minutes. I'm just going to talk about the first three very quickly. The first one, box layout. If you just think about both CSS and XSL-FO as being made up of boxes, they're all made up of rectangular boxes at this point, then you've covered 90% of your uses for CSS. Boxes can have content around that. You can have padding to separate the content from the border, and then there's properties for margins. CSS and XSL-FO have common properties for all of these. In XSL-FO will map some of the margin properties to more direction-specific properties, because it initially paid more attention to the directionality of text than CSS did at the time. But they have the same concept of a box has padding, margin, and border. In page layout, because this is all about page media, in XSL-FO you make a simple page master which can have these 5 regions, the region body and then the 4 outer regions, and then you can direct content into those, and they're not further subdivided unless you pour content into them that perhaps has a table or something in them. CSS defines a page area, and then the area around it is the margin area, and as we'll see, that's divided into 16 page margin boxes. So as I sort of said, in XSL-FO, you generate static content and you direct it to different named the page outer regions with the different names. So we have one here for the even header. This static content is only used on the headers of even pages, and for this one here is called first outside. The only page master that has a region name like that is the first one. So we have something different on the opening page of our chapter. So the FO concept is pouring static content into named regions, which might or might not be on a particular page. The CSS concept is, as I said, you have these page margin boxes, and they have particular names, and you can direct content to those in your either as the string value of an element that is still in your appears in the flow of your document, or you can generate content for it, or you can declare an element as a running element, and it's taken out of the flow and used in one of these page margin boxes. It's essentially, it's equivalent for FO, you generate content in a static content to be used in the outer regions, but for CSS, the content is still part of the flow, but it serves a similar function. So the second part in the remaining time, if I'm lucky, is to talk about how we produce this book, this XSL-FO CSS comparison, which is available formatted from XSL-FO and formatted from CSS. And the pages that are produced are so identical, you really need the antenna house regression testing system to find the differences between the pages. For the most part, line endings are the same, so obviously the pages break on the same words, etc. How this is produced is the CSS version, HTML, as I've said, it's augmented to update the table of contents, create the sidebars, the text for the sidebars, and actually the offset for the sidebars, and then it's formatted, the CSS format using CSS style sheets. And you'll see the XSLT version takes the same augmented HTML to produce XSL-FO, which is then formatted with the XSL formatter. Oops, I hope I didn't blind anybody. So you see, I've said most of this already, that the authoring HTML is augmented for table of contents, etc., that you really don't want to have to maintain by hand in the authoring document. And there's syntax highlighting the code samples, which you really don't want to have to maintain by hand. The CSS styles are based on the same styles that we used for the introduction to CSS for Page Media, and just it was done in the interest of time and for consistency to just reuse the same styles. The FO, the XSLT that generates the FO starts, as I said, from the augmented HTML, and it re-implements the CSS styles. It's just, the part that I wrote for this was just the stuff in the CSS styles for the book. I didn't have to write a complete transformation from HTML to FO because there was already one on the Antenna House website. But I did update parts of it to run as XSLT3 rather than XSLT1. The HTML to FO style sheet, the XSLT1 version is still on the Antenna House website. Since it's in XSLT 1.0, it makes a lot of use of XSL attribute set, which has its uses because you can have a named attribute set and add to it from different modules to build up or override properties. Another feature of attribute sets, which doesn't get used very often, I don't think, is that attributes are evaluated every time you use them. So the party trick is to generate an ID that is different every time you reference the attribute set. Of course, the problem with attribute sets is that while you can add attributes to an attribute set, you can't take any away, which contrasts that with CSS, where you might have a style for an element like table, and you might have a different class of table that has additional properties defined for it, and those properties are applicable there. If you added border color and border style to an attribute set, then they'd remain with that attribute set for the entire processing. And I didn't really want to maintain separate attribute sets for every possible context. So I did a variation on something I presented, if you have a history for trivia, back in 2014 about comparing maps with using attribute sets. This time around, I'm declaring a table of local properties as a map, which I'm declaring everything for the table in one place. In the real code, there's multiple entries in this outer map, and I declare the properties and their values. This obviously is a string, but that could itself be an expression, or it could be a function that calculates something more complicated. Might be a function you provide an XPath to go off and find something else. You might have also seen that there's a parameter which could be overriding properties that would override the properties in this one. So the next step is to merge the ones I inherited, potentially, whatever they are, and to take priority over the ones that are declared here, and then to use next match to find the next less specific template for these standard tables and provide my set of properties to it, and it would use my set of properties to override whatever else it would declare. And how this would be used, again, cut down from the code, is the table properties are passed here, and it's just a function that picks out the properties of interest and adds them to what you can't see. There's a table element created there. So in this way, I was able to replicate, for the most part, well, I was able to replicate how a class adds extra properties in a specific circumstance. So possible future work for this would be to further expand the comparison document. It's a bit like a fractal. You look at it and you see the detail, then you drill down, there's more detail that you can see. I mean, there is a limit to how much detail anybody wants to go into about the differences and commonalities, but if you go and look at the book, you will find that the later chapters are getting shorter as time ran out and I ran out of energy. So Antenna House doesn't actually need a universal CSS to XSL-FO translation tool because we have a CSS formatter, but I've been using Transpect and CSSA for something else, and it has occurred to me that you could perhaps use that to use the CSS tools. It makes attributes for all of the CSS, all the properties in your CSS. It resolves the priorities, and then you can process that with XSLT as you like. So the comparison, we say that there are these common core properties which follow from the tag decision, the architectural principle for the web, that where possible properties should be in common. There are some obvious differences. I've shown you how the pages are made and how content is directed to the headers and footers. And there's many minor differences. If you want to know more, read the book. AH Formatter smooths out many of the differences because a lot is implemented for the other. And as you saw, it's possible to produce output which is functionally identical using either XSL-FO or CSS. You could make a general transformation that does this. I mean, Oxygen has a product which will do this. But as I said, I don't particularly need to do it to solve my need. So there's the URL, and thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Tony. And we have time for questions. So from Ken, yeah.
Thank you, Tony. I just wanted to augment your list of available resources, something I meant to mention yesterday, but I ran way over time, thanks to the patience of the organizers. But 5 years ago, I made my FO book and my XSLT book freely downloadable from my website instead of selling it anymore. So if anyone's looking for a tutorial approach to learning more about FO, just go to cranesoftrights.com. On the right-hand side, it says free books. And you can go to the free books and download any one of the books that I used to sell. So,
thank you. So do we have more questions? So it seems that everybody is willing to have another coffee. So thank you very much again.
All right, thank you.
And we will meet there 5 minutes after 4 o'clock, so enjoy your coffee break.